Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Blake Farmer, and this is Nashville. One of the fun facts about Nashville is that we have the greatest concentration of Kurdish Americans. Growing up here and even covering the news here for a long time, I got bits and pieces of the story about how the Kurds arrived. But it was rather one-dimensional, never the full picture. Well, WPLN's Rose Gilbert has spent the last year piecing together the story of how Kurds came to call Nashville home. And it is an epic tale that took her all the way to Kurdistan and back. So this week, we are going on that journey with her. And today, it's episode 1 of The Country in Our Hearts.
The story I'm about to tell you starts with a family. 9 small children, a mother, a father, running for their lives.
I think he had like 2 to 3 babies on his back. Then he also had his rifle.
Picking up everything they could carry and fleeing on foot from their small village in the mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan.
You know, it became a full-on decision, like a rush. Okay, now it's time to go.
I remember, like walking just day and night.
As Saddam Hussein's army hunted them down.
The word came around that he is literally going to kill every single person.
They made it to Turkey and eventually all the way to Nashville, Tennessee.
I mean, we love the country music.
And so did many others. Entire Kurdish villages found refuge in this southern city.
I made a promise that I would not forget about my people, the ones who struggle.
It's an epic story. A story of bloody genocide, of sacrifice, of stunning perseverance.
As the victims, we feel Saddam is still alive.
It's a story as old as time itself, one of exile and displacement, about a tangle of political alliances and the people caught in the middle.
My family's stuck. There's nowhere for them to go. What if they're caught in the middle of all these wars?
It's a story about America, the promises it's kept and the promises it's broken.
We want our flag raised with other nations. We want independence. We want our country.
But it's also about a country that only exists in the hearts of its people, and the lengths they'll go to make it real. I'm Rose Gilbert, and from Nashville Public Radio, you're listening to The Country in Our Hearts. This is episode 1, The Enemy Within. Hey, how are you? Good, thank you. Good, how are you?
Give me a couple of minutes.
Yeah, no worries. Jihan International Market sits on a busy stretch of Nolensville Pike in South Nashville. Locals call this area Little Kurdistan, but it's not really that little. Nashville is home to the largest Kurdish community in the U.S. More Kurdish people live here, in this booming southern city, than anywhere else in America. Nashville's Little Kurdistan lives in markets like Jihan, where shawarma roasts slowly while the bakery churns out traditional Middle Eastern breads.
Every day, fresh.
The market's owner is Nash Chalke, a friendly guy in his late 40s. And today, he's taking a break from his work to tell me a story. He starts by pouring us cups of tea from a gleaming copper boiler.
It's
a beautiful machine.
Custom made and imported, so yeah. Kurdish people, like all day long, we drink tea.
Teas in hand, we settle into a booth next to a display of fresh, honeyed baklava.
Fresh made.
Then he starts telling me about Chalke. Chalke is his last name, but it's also the village where he was born.
It's a gorgeous, beautiful place.
A village perched in the mountains of northern Iraq.
Right now it's abandoned. Not many people, have any houses and stuff to it, but you can still see the old village is still there.
Nash is Kurdish, a large ethnic group living mostly in Iraq, Turkey, Syria, and Iran. The Kurds, over 30 million strong, have their own distinct language, their own dress, their own holidays, their own culture. What they don't have is their own state. They are one of the largest stateless people in the world. And that unites them.
Like in every Kurd, lives a Kurdistan, like in our hearts.
The tea Nash prepared for me is strong, sweet, and already nearly gone when he starts telling me about the first time he was forced to flee Chalke with his family.
Actually, I was 6 months old and we had to run.
It was 1976 and the Iraqi army had come to Chalke, hunting down Kurdish freedom fighters known as Peshmerga, which included Nash's father.
So my dad, he was one of the Peshmergas that literally was on a list, for them to catch. I mean, he was a warrior.
Everyone had to drop what they were doing, cooking, tending to the crops, laundry, and flee for cover. It was chaos.
My mom tells me the stories that I fell from her hand. So she literally left me behind. Some other people had to catch me and bring me. But
they ended up fleeing to Turkey. It was the beginning of a childhood on the run.
Somebody would just shout, hey, helicopters, and, everybody would just, we would just knew exactly, it was an instinct thing. Everybody knew how to hide.
By the time Nash was 12 years old, his family had fled some 20 times. And somehow, they always found a way to regroup and return to Chalke. But all that changed in the summer of 1988. That was the year Nash and his family, and tens of thousands of other Kurds, fled their homeland for good. 1988 was a bad year to be Kurdish in Iraq. The region had erupted in conflict. Iraq was at war with Iran, and that put the Kurds in serious danger. Just a few years earlier, Iran had supported Kurdish forces as they fought a long, drawn-out rebellion against Iraq. But now, in this new war, Iran was the enemy, and by association, so were the Kurds. To Iraq and to Saddam Hussein, the Kurds were a dangerous internal threat, a threat that needed to be eliminated. That year, Nash was 12 and only kind of knew what was going on. Most of his days were spent playing outside with his cousins, helping his uncle with the livestock, and watching Knight Rider on the TV his father had brought back from one of his missions as a Peshmerga general.
Michael Knight, a young loner on a crusade to champion the cause of the innocent, the helpless, the powerless, in a world of criminals who operate above the law.
Then, one day that summer,
late afternoon, and my uncle came and asked my mom that, hey, gather the kids, gather everything, and go.
His uncle had come to tell them the Iraqi army, yet again, had come to Chalke. And yet again, chaos broke out. Nash's memory of the day is spotty, but he recalls his mother telling him to get his younger sister, to keep her safe.
So I grabbed my sister, and then my older brother, he came, he grabbed one of my other siblings, and he was very, very brave. He wasn't scared.
This time, 12 years after Nash had first fled in the arms of a neighbor, it was his turn to carry a child to safety. And that wasn't the only difference. Nash heard panicked warnings spread through the village.
Because Saddam, they say he's coming, he's going to catch everyone, and the word came around that he is literally going to kill every single person.
Villagers rushed to grab anything they could carry. Babies, toddlers, food, blankets, guns.
You don't have time to do anything. You either, stay behind and die, or you just leave.
They left their homes and trekked up into the mountains towards the little stream that fed their village.
I remember, walking just day and night, all the way till we make it to the Turkish border. And at this time, I remember as if it happened. All I know is just all the dolls just crying and screaming.
They walked for 2 long, tense days, the sound of the dogs howling ringing in their ears. Nash remembers straining to listen for the sound of gunshots or approaching helicopters. As they walked, he says his grandmother told stories and recited passages from the Quran to try and keep the kids calm. But he knew, in his bones, that this was different than all the times they'd fled before.
We just left and we never returned back.
Eventually, they made it to Turkey, but they weren't exactly welcomed. There was talk of sending the refugees back over the border.
The news was that, hey, even though we all escaped, from Saddam's path, that we were going to be all handed over back to him. And we knew if we were to be handed over, back to him, that he would kill every single one.
After an excruciating wait, they were loaded into Mack trucks and carted off to a refugee camp in the city of Diyarbakir. It was safer than staying in Iraq, but conditions in the camp were harsh. At first, food was scarce, and the thousands of refugees were held under armed guard. Nash tells me about sneaking under the fence to find work. First, picking cotton, then selling sweets around town, before eventually working his way up to selling cigarettes at a local restaurant.
I did that, and I started making a lot of money.
As the months passed, Nash began to hear rumors about something terrible that had happened. Rumors that had traveled to the camp from hundreds of miles away.
There was mentions of, Halabja.
Halabja is a small Kurdish city on the Iran-Iraq border, on the opposite side of the country from Chalke, a place 12-year-old Nash had never even heard of. But suddenly the name was everywhere, spoken in hushed voices all across the camp.
I can recall a little bit of things, saying that there were, chemical, used on these people.
It was something the adults wouldn't talk about in front of the kids.
Animals, nothing survived.
Even now, as a grown man, years later, safe in Nashville, Nash struggles to describe exactly what happened in Halabja and what it meant for Kurdish people.
It was a very, very big thing.
It was a massacre. Kurdish history is pockmarked with massacres. But what happened in Halabja was something new and chilling, even for people who were no strangers to the brutality of war. Over time, it was immortalized in paintings, sculpture, and songs like this one. But I had never heard of Halabja. I hadn't even been born when it happened. Growing up in Kentucky, there weren't a lot of Kurdish people around. Then I moved to Nashville, where I was introduced to Kurdish theme nights at hockey games and Kurdish New Year celebrations. And of course the food. Kebabs, cheese rolls, the bread. Many, many different kinds of bread. And when I started talking to people, during interviews at kitchen tables, markets, mosques, Halabja came up, again and again and again.
Halabja city.
The chemical bombing in Halabja.
Yeah, that was horrific. The images were horrific.
But when
Halabja happened, they decided to get their citizenship.
They bomb with the chemicals,
Straight from Halabja.
Halabja loomed large in the lives of so many Kurds. It was a grim and very important milestone. A huge chapter in the story of how Nashville became home to the largest Kurdish community in America. The thing beneath the theme nights and restaurants and New Year's festivals. And so there was no way I could do this story justice, do Nash's story justice, if I didn't understand this massacre. I needed to talk to the people who survived it, had witnessed the fallout, and see how they were living today. I needed to go to Halabja. I needed to go to Kurdistan. More after the break.
Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org. Funding for This Is Nashville comes from Burr & Foreman Law Firm, serving clients with transactional, litigation, and regulatory needs. Discovering how each client defines a win and working with them every step of the way to achieve it. Burr.com.
I'm Blake Farmer, and this is Nashville. This hour, we're listening to a special reporting project from WPLN's Rose Gilbert. She's chronicled the saga of how so many Kurdish Americans came to call Nashville home, making this the largest group of Kurds in North America. At the end of the hour, we'll also have Rose in the studio to answer some questions about her reporting. Now back to episode 1, The Enemy Within.
For now, I'm saying goodbye to Nash
Bye-bye.
and setting off from Nashville to Iraqi Kurdistan.
To the airport.
3 flights, a long drive through the mountains, and 2 full days of travel later, and I'm here, Halabja. It's nearly midday, blazing hot. The city's narrow streets are quiet except for a few men eating lunch in a shady park, the loose chickens pecking at their feet. I see store windows full of pomegranates, which the city is famous for. I keep going past the city center. The streets get newer, wider, dustier, with very little shade or cover, which makes it easier to see my destination. A soaring monument, a 100-foot tower of curving metal beams topped with a Kurdish flag. And beneath it, a museum dedicated to remembering this massacre. There, along with my translator, I meet a man named Luqman Abdulkadir. He wears a black suit, instantly recognizable as Kurdish by its loose trousers and the patterned sash tied at his waist. His dark hair and mustache are beginning to go gray, and behind the pair of glasses, his eyes are clouded and scarred. Luqman is the president of the Halabja Chemical Victims Association. As we arrive, the armed guard stationed at the monument's entrance smiles when he sees Luqman and asks how he's doing. Inside the lobby, a group of older men sit in a cluster of plastic chairs, chatting and twirling strings of prayer beads as casually as if they were hanging out at a favorite tea house. The men all seem to be regulars here. I'm not exactly sure why they'd want to spend time at a monument built to remember the worst day of their lives. Except maybe there's no use trying to forget about it. It's the thing they carry with them every day, the thing they can't avoid. And if you have to carry that burden, I imagine it's got to be better with company. Among these men is Luqman. In 1988, Nash and his family fled their village and escaped into the mountains. Luqman wasn't as lucky. There was no time, no last-minute warning for what was coming for him or for the people of Halabja. It was March 16th, 1988, springtime, a time to plant crops and prepare for Nowruz, the Kurdish New Year celebration. The skies were clear and blue. Luqman Abdulkadir was a young man and newly married.
I was 20 years old. I was a naughty guy, naughty boy.
He was getting ready for lunch with his family when they saw them.
هر ئەوەندەمان زانی سعات 11:45 دقة پۆلێک فڕۆکەی عێراق هاتنە سەر ئاسمانی ئەم شارە و دیارە بۆردمانەکانیشان بە نەخشەیەکی عەسکەری پلان بۆ داڕێژرا بۆردمانی ئەم شارەیان کرد. سەرەتای بۆردمانەکە بە ناپاڵم بوو بۆەوەی دەرگا و پەنجەرەکان بشکێنێ و دواتر چەکێکیمیان بەکارهێنا.
We saw fighter jets circling the town above. We could hear them and see them. And at first they did they bombed the town with something called napalm. I think that's kind of, napalm. Yeah, they bombed it with that, and they were very strategic in their attack. When the napalm attack happened, all the windows broke.
With the windows blown out, their homes couldn't protect them from what was to come. Bombings had become common in Halabja, caught as it was in the middle of the Iran-Iraq war. Terrifying, but common. So Luqman wasn't surprised when a second round of bombs were unleashed just a couple hours later. But this time was different. The bombs didn't go off.
لە ژێرزەمینەکە مانگوت سپاس بۆ خوای گەورە بۆمبەکە نەتەقیەوە لەوانەیە لە شوێنێکی ئەرزێکی قوڕاوی دابێ یان لە شوێنێکی دابێ ئەرزەکە نەرم بوو بێ دەنگی بۆمبەکان کپ بوون بەڵام کاتێکمان زانی یەکێک لەو بۆمبانە دای لە بینی ماڵی ئێمە و کاک عەلی.
And we were happy. We were like, thankfully, these bombs don't explode. Like, you know.
They thought they'd gotten lucky. Then the bomb started to emit a strange smoke.
دای لە بینی ماڵی ئێمە و دراوسەکەمان ماڵی کاک عەلی ناوبوو. ئیتر بۆنێکی زۆر ناخۆشیە بوو. بۆنی هێلکەی گەنیوێدا، بۆنی غازی تەباخ و شتی وایەدا. تووشی ڕشانەوە بووین. لەوێنە تەوەقعمان نەکرد کیمیایی بە یەکسەرەتا.
It had an awful smell. Smelled like rotten eggs or something like that. And we didn't know it was a chemical attack. And then we started throwing up. We developed sore eyes and sore throats, and we began like puking, throwing up. And
کەوی ماڵیمان هەبوو کەوەکان مردن یەکسەر.
And we had pigeons, they died right away.
مانگامان هەبوو لە حەوشەکە گەوڕمان هەبوو مانگاکانمان کەوتنە لە قەفڕێ بە دیاری خۆمانەوە.
We saw our cows like dying.
At first, they figured they were just irritated by the smoke. They fed the animals pomegranate sauce to try and soothe their throats. But they kept getting worse, their legs twitching in the air. Lukman realized they needed to get out, now.
حل لە هەڵەبجە دەرچوین لە ماڵەوە دەرچوین بینیمان شار وێران بووە بە خۆمانمان نەزانی و ڕێگاکان گیراون جەنازە کەوتونە سەر ئەو جادانە یەکەم جارم بوو من بەو شێوە ئینسان ببینم بە مردووی هەموومان شڵەژان بەڕاست.
So as soon as we left home, we saw dead bodies everywhere, piles of dead bodies on the streets, and we had never seen something like that. We were all like shocked and didn't know what to do.
ئێستش هەموو جارێک چۆن فیلمی سینەمایی بە کورتکراوەی پیشانە درێت زۆر جار ئێستش ئەو دیمەدانە لە بەرچاوم بێن و ئەڕۆن.
It just still plays in my head like a fast movie being played as a fast pace. I still see those scenes again and again, over and over again.
ئەو خەڵکێک بە دیار چاومانەوە گیانی ئەدا زۆر ینی نازانم چۆن دەری ببڕەمەوە ئێستا خەڵکێک بە دیار تۆ بمرە نتوانی چی بۆ بکەی.
I don't know how to verbalize it, but people were dying. I would see them on the road, they were dying.
Lukman began to feel worse and worse. His skin, throat, nose, and eyes stung badly. Soon, he couldn't see at all. He and his family fled to a nearby town. Normally, it would be a quick half-hour walk. But sick and blind, they didn't make it there until well past midnight. They didn't know it, but Lukman and his family had just become victims of a genocide. A genocide that was years in the making. What happened on March 16th, 1988 was sudden. It was devastating. And it was part of a 7-month-long Iraqi military campaign called Al-Anfal, meaning the spoils of war. Al-Anfal was designed by Saddam Hussein and his generals to destroy the Iranian-aligned Kurdish Peshmerga by destroying the Kurds themselves. Men and boys over the age of 12 were the primary targets, but sometimes entire villages disappeared into mass graves. Chemical weapons were part of the strategy, and Halabja was far from the only town to be hit. There was the town of Haladan, where a survivor described people unable to speak because their throats were so badly burned. The Jafati Valley, where some people abandoned their children in the chaos. The village of Wade, where a woman says she saw people jump into the water to try and escape the poison, only to find the water was poisoned too. And many more. The exact death toll from this campaign is unknowable, but some estimate that up to 180,000 people were killed. To understand how this could happen, Halabja, Al-Anfal, this year of death, I want to tell you some history about how the Kurds have been betrayed again and again. Earlier in this episode, Nash called his father a warrior.
He was a warrior.
And that was no exaggeration. Kurdish Peshmerga were skilled guerrilla fighters, peerless in their knowledge of their native mountains. That made them valuable allies. But their dream of a homeland to call their own also made them susceptible to being used by world powers as pawns and proxy fighters. For most of the 60s and 70s, Kurdish Peshmerga fighters were allied with Iran and the US, fighting a rebellion against Iraq. But in 1975, the US brokered a deal between Iran and Iraq. Support from the US and Iran was cut off, leaving the Kurds highly vulnerable. In the wake of this deal, Iraq started a campaign of retribution, hunting down Peshmerga and their families. That is where we started this episode, Nash's family fleeing from this retribution.
So my dad, he was one of the Peshmergas that literally was on a list, for them to catch.
When asked about betraying our Kurdish allies, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger reportedly said, covert action should not be confused with missionary work. Then, in 1979, revolution broke out in Iran. The Shah of Iran, America's old ally, was gone.
University students demonstrating in Tehran, shouting death to the Shah, pledge allegiance to the Islamic movement of the Ayatollahs.
That same year, there was the Iran hostage crisis, which had America holding its breath, counting the days.
Thursday, April 3rd, 1980, the 152nd day of captivity for the American hostages in Iran. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News. Good night.
It was in the midst of all this upheaval that Iran and Iraq went to war. But this time, the United States was backing Iraq, offering Saddam Hussein military intelligence, helicopters, and billions in economic aid. The U.S. wasn't thrilled about supporting Iraq. Kissinger said at the time, it's a pity they both can't lose. Still, in the eyes of the U.S., defeating Iran was more important than anything else, including the Kurds. Meanwhile, Iraq was developing a deadly chemical weapons program. A lot of people tried to lie about what happened next, but here's what we know for sure. By 1983, Iraq had deployed chemical weapons against both Iran and the Kurds. The Iraqi military even released a press statement, quote, "For every harmful insect, there is an insecticide."
Nizar Hamdoun, the ambassador of Iraq, what, in your opinion, should the United States government be doing to bring about peace in the Middle East?
Well, I think lots of things should be done, and here I should not suggest that it's an easy job.
Nizar Hamdoun was America's go-to guy in the Hussein regime. In 1986, he made multiple appearances on C-SPAN on, of all things, a live call-in show where he fielded viewers' questions, including questions about Iraq's use of chemical weapons.
Norman, Oklahoma, you're our next caller. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good evening. I've been one of your fans of the program for a long time.
Questions like this one, which, chillingly, came about 16 months before Halabja.
But I was really disappointed to see you inviting a representative from a regime that is responsible for so many crimes. I wanted Mr. Hamdoun to express some points, if he can, if he does have any answer. The use of chemical weapons and many other violations of international law, which I don't speak of myself, but it is actually recorded by the Red Cross, and which unfortunately is not being reflected by the news media here.
Hamdoun dismissed this accusation as Iranian propaganda, a tall tale told by a fanatical enemy to explain why it was losing ground to smaller, weaker Iraq.
Chemical weapons, this is the Khomeini argument to tell the Iranian people why the divine troops of Islam were not able to overcome that small country, which is one-third the Iranian state, and why they could not overcome the infidel government of Baghdad, according to their standards, for 7 years. And they, the soldiers of Islam, with the Imam who is the deputy of the Prophet, how come they don't overcome Iraq? So the only explanation that they were chemical weapons.
What Hamdoun said was a lie platformed on an American broadcast and directed at the American public. What's more, the United States government knew and tried to keep it under wraps. Privately, the Reagan administration pressured the United Nations not to take action against Iraq. Hamdoun, despite what he said on C-SPAN, later admitted that Iraq did use chemical weapons against Iran. However, he continued to deny that the military ever used them against Iraq's Kurdish population. But here's the thing. What happened in Halabja was undeniable, because Halabja had been documented. Halabja was on video. Almost immediately after the attack, Iranian journalists arrived on the scene with TV crews and cameras rolling. They recorded the streets full of corpses, people who had collapsed while fleeing, people spilling out of trucks that never made it to safety, and many, many parents cradling their lifeless children. In one tape, journalists come across a man in a suit like Lukman's, standing just outside the door of his home.
کی بمبارون کرده اینجا رو صدام بمبارون کرده
The man pulls back the curtain from the doorway to show the corpses of his family lying on a blanket inside. No matter what the Iraqi government or Nizar Hamdoun had to say, how readily they denied what they'd done, the work of those Iranian journalists proved what had happened in Halabja. It was an atrocity the Kurds could point to, evidence of just how bad things were and had been for a long, long time. Walking outside the memorial, Lukman points out a statue, a man with a camera leaning over to take a picture of two corpses. Immediately I recognized it, a recreation of the most iconic image of this tragedy, one I'd seen dozens of times at this point. A man in traditional Kurdish clothes holding his baby. Both had died in the street while trying to escape.
So this is not any specific figure, but this is a statue for all the photojournalists who came here to respect their work, you know. Because of those photographers that people know about what happened here.
After the attack, Lukman and his family made it to a neighboring town and eventually Iran. He was badly injured, but in a sense, he was also lucky. One of just a couple dozen victims Iranian doctors selected out of thousands to be airlifted to Germany for treatment.
I couldn't talk either at the time. I had lost my capacity. I was all burned up. When I was lying on a stretcher in the plane, and somebody in the plane came to me and it was like, somebody wants to talk to you. I raised my head. I saw my sister, but I couldn't talk to her because I couldn't say, I had lost the capacity to talk.
Lukman had suffered extensive burns on his skin, eyes, lungs, and airways. After months of treatment and surgeries, he regained some vision in one of his eyes, but lost nearly all of his lung capacity. When he returned to Iran, he learned that his mother, his wife, 2 of his brothers, and 2 of his little sisters had died from their injuries. The hospital gave him photos of their bodies to identify. Now he takes out his phone and shows them to me.
Oh, they were so young. Oh my goodness.
2 little girls, big brown eyes open and unseeing, blood caked around their mouths. I felt ill. I felt angry. How could this be the enemy Iraq needed to eliminate? I knew, of course, that children had been killed in Halabja, but it was something else entirely to see these 2 faces, so clear and up close, so recently alive, so obviously dead. Lukman looks at the images unflinchingly. He says the attack replays in his mind constantly. It's painful to remember, but impossible to forget.
For us, the victims, we feel Saddam is still alive.
That lingering pain is psychological and physical. Survivors like Lukman live with serious health conditions caused by the nerve agents used in the massacre. Burns, blindness, breathing problems, cancer, birth defects, not to mention PTSD. Conditions that require medical treatment, which requires money. The Halabja Chemical Victims Association is working with a Chicago-based law firm and their attorney.
25 کۆمپانیا و کەسایەتی هێناوە کە دەستیان هەبوو لە تاوانەکە سکاڵامان لەسەر کردوون و خۆشبەختانە نوێنەری کۆمپانیاکانیش حزوری هەیە لە دادگای سلێمانی و حوتی دەژ مرافعەمانە احتیمالی هەیە چەند مرافعەیەکی تر بڕیارەکە دەرچێ و ببرێتە ئەڵمانیا ببرێتە فەڕەنسا ئەو وڵاتانەی کۆمپانیاکانی لێبۆ کەسایەتیەکانی لێبۆ دەوێت داوای قەرەبوویان لێبکرێت.
He is Piawanya. He's representing us in a lawsuit against 25 entities, including governments and companies.
A lawsuit against people and companies in Germany, America, and France that sold the ingredients for chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein. The full lawsuit is 156 pages. As I scroll through it, I realize that most of those pages are just names, and most of the people those names belong to were dead. As I read through the details, I learn that Lukman's new bride was 3 months pregnant with their first child when she died. She's listed with the rest of his family, at the very top of the document. Lukman has been trying to win some kind of reparations since 2018. I ask him if he's still hopeful that this lawsuit could work.
So, of course, you when you came here, you had hope that you could get your interviews done, right? Also, we are always hopeful that our work won't be futile.
After talking to Lukman, seeing his photos, spending time at this museum, I better understood what the Kurds were running from, what Nash's family was running from. Total annihilation. That was what it took to get them to flee Chalke for good. It made me curious about this village, this place his family kept coming back to, even when it was dangerous. I was also curious what was there today, who was left, why had they stayed behind, and what could they tell me? So I left Halabja and headed to the opposite side of the country to see the place where Nash's story began. As I traveled west, the winding mountain roads leveled out into vast stretches of flat, arid land. I passed towns, fields of crops coaxed from the dry earth by spindly irrigation systems, shepherds on horseback. The air was thick with dust, making everything look hazy and far away. The scenery was striking, but what really stuck out to me were the checkpoints. Peace is still a bit of a high-wire act around here. Since the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the fall of Saddam Hussein, Kurds have had their own autonomous region in northern Iraq. It's not a full-fledged independent state, but they do have their own regional government. And the Peshmerga have gone from outlaw freedom fighters to an officially sanctioned military force. A military force that has spent the better part of the past decade at war on the front lines against the terrorist group ISIS. So, plenty of checkpoints, manned by armed Peshmerga with Kurdish flag patches on their uniforms. I passed through about 10 of them on the way. My taxi driver turns to me, points at my passport, and gives me a big thumbs up. America, he says approvingly. I understand what he means. As a U.S. citizen, I'm allowed to pass through these checkpoints without much scrutiny. We keep heading west. I was looking forward to seeing Chalke. Nash told me it was beautiful, a lush green village set on top of a hill. And he said he knew just the person to take me there. His younger brother, Aran Ibrahim, who years ago moved back to Kurdistan. I told you this was a story about a family fleeing annihilation and building new lives. But it's also the story of the younger generation. People like Aran who grew up pretty much entirely in America, but are now making their own choices. Choices their parents never had, including whether or not they want to leave America and go back to Kurdistan to try and reclaim some of what their families lost. Finally, I arrived to meet Nash's younger brother, Aran.
All right, you ready?
Yeah.
Should we just head out?
Yeah, let's do it. It's time to see the place Nash is named for, the place he was forced to flee as a child, and now the place his brother has returned so many years later. It's time to see Chalke.
Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Blake Farmer, and this is Nashville. We just heard the first episode of Nashville Public Radio's new podcast, The Country in Our Hearts. It tells the story of how Nashville came to be home to the largest Kurdish community in the United States. And we're listening together this week and also hearing from the people behind this deep reporting that's gone on over the last year. Rose Gilbert is the host and reporter in the WPLN newsroom, and she's here with us in the studio. Hi, Rose.
Hi, Blake.
So today we're talking episode 1, but this entire series is now out in the wild. Anyone can go listen to all the episodes and binge them if they want. How does it feel, though, to the person who has been working on this so closely for the last year?
Oh, man, it feels amazing, to be honest. It feels really good.
How do you feel about the response that you're getting, both from folks who are not Kurdish and the Kurds who've been part of the project?
You know, it's been really nice. It's been really lovely to hear, of course, from Kurdish folks who have listened and have, expressed that it's really nice to hear their stories, or there are parts of the story that resonate with them, even if they're not part of this family, or maybe they're not even from Nashville, or maybe they didn't even settle in the U.S., but there are elements of this story of being a refugee, becoming part of the diaspora that resonate really widely, right? So that's been lovely to hear. And then it's been cool to hear from people who didn't know that much about this, right? Like it's been cool to hear from people who, I had one person say that their dad listened, and that he isn't normally a big NPR consumer, but because this was talking about Saddam Hussein, he was like, "Oh, what's going on?" Like, well, I'll tune in, and that was interesting to hear.
Well, I count myself among them because I'm almost sad to say I only had a couple of sentences I probably could have said about how did Nashville come to be home to so many people from Kurdistan? And what is Kurdistan? So I'm learning right along with that guy, and I happen to listen to more NPR than he does probably. So you probably could have pieced together this story, the story of Nashville Kurds, without going to Kurdistan yourself. But, we know how valuable it is as journalists to be on the ground, and you spent, I think, more than a month on the ground. Specifically for this story, why did you feel compelled to make this journey to the other side of the world?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I was lucky enough to spend a little over a month in Iraqi Kurdistan. I think land is so central to this story. Kurdistan is not a country. It's not a sovereign nation. It's a region that falls across 4 other countries. And for over a century, much of the history of the Kurdish people has been about fighting for unity or autonomy or freedom within that land, having land taken away, fighting for it back. And it's become a part of Kurdish identity, I would say. Like there's this very famous Kurdish saying, "We have no friends but the mountains," which expresses this idea of isolation, but also this kind of capital R romantic attachment to the mountains, which have taken on this identity as a protection, as a symbol of identity, and also a key part of the strategy of the guerrilla warriors known as Peshmerga. But just to give you an idea of how important this connection is to a lot of people, when I visited the graveyard in the village that I went to, Chalke, in Kurdistan, there were a lot of people buried there who had lived and died in Nashville, but asked for their bodies to be sent back and buried in their home village.
In other words, even as much as they might have been connected and felt like Nashville was home, this place in the mountains, even though it can't be found on a map, most maps anyway. They wanted their body to be there with their family.
Exactly. And just seeing, especially maybe for folks who are from the diaspora and visiting, there's this real joy when they're able to eat food that was grown on their family's land or drink water from the stream that feeds their village, just kind of reconnection, this very physical reconnection that I was lucky enough to see and be a little bit of a part of.
Yeah. You know, in this episode, you go back to this dark chapter of Kurdish history, the Halabja massacre. And I got the impression from your reporting that it was like something people started saying to you, and you're like, this is clearly a big turning point. When did you start piecing together just how important that particular attack was to Nashville Kurds?
I mean, it just came up like unprompted. People
Really?
would just bring it up. Not it's not like, I'd be at the checkout at the international market and someone would say, oh, by the way. But in my conversations about, why did you leave?
Right.
What's important to understand about Kurdish history, Halabja.
It's like their 9/11 or something, right? Like they know that day, they remember what they were doing.
Yes, because it was a turning point. Because one thing that is really true about this family and so many other families is the idea of the Iraqi army or the Ba'athist Party being a threat to Kurdish people was not new. Many of the people I spoke to had fled time and time again and gone back.
They'd gone like into the mountains before.
Yeah, sometimes it would be like, the helicopters are here, go hide in the cave and we'll come back later. Sometimes it would be like, we're going to Turkey for a couple of years and then we're coming back. But that was the story of a lot of people's lives for a long time. But then in 1988, something changes. And part of what changes is Halabja, which is this terrible massacre with this chemical attack that just wipes everybody out. No time to run, no time to fight. People died as they tried to run for their lives, right? And I think that psychologically was a huge turning point.
We might not have time to run.
Have time to run. So that even though the family that I followed lived nowhere near Halabja, they heard about it. And when the Iraqi army got to their doorstep, they're like, this is what could happen to us.
I see. So the terror really set in then.
Yeah, so I felt it was just such an important place to start to understand this is why people left and didn't come back.
Right. You know, as I was listening, I heard a lot of Kurdish, as in the language, rather than, our translators kind of hopping on top of it as you hear in radio stories all the time. Was this like an intentional stylistic production choice?
Yes. So I had the luxury of time in a podcast, right? A radio story, a lot of times you have 1:30. You got to get in there. I had the luxury of time, and I wanted to include as much whole Kurdish as I could because it's a language that at different times has been banned or suppressed because it was such a strong marker of Kurdish identity. So I wanted to make sure to include the sound of the language and as much as was possible here. And I don't know, it was really lovely to hear. And the more you hear it, the more you get used to the rhythms of it. You kind of, I hope that people by the end of a podcast, if you guys listen to all 4 episodes, by the end of it, you'll kind of have an ear for what Kurdish sounds like, even if you don't understand it.
Do you hear much Kurdish around Nashville, or is it pretty much going to be English if you're going in someone's house, for instance?
Depends on where you are.
Yeah.
And more than anything, it depends on what generation of folks you're talking to. Lots of folks speak perfect, fluent English, but some of the older generations might not speak as fluently, or they might prefer to speak in Kurdish, especially at home or when they're in a majority Kurdish space. The other thing is there's also kind of a new wave of Kurdish folks arriving from Turkey in the past few years, and some of those folks might also, not have had as much time to learn English yet as well.
So the name of the show is The Country in Our Hearts, and that's what we're talking about. We're here with producer Rose Gilbert. But the name is there because it literally is a country that is not on the map, but only in the hearts of its people, as in folks who are Kurdish. But I want to ask about the graphic of the show. So if you haven't seen it, then you don't know what I'm talking about. The graphic that you'll see appear with the podcast, if you're listening there or on our website, it's this handwritten red on yellow, kind of square, wrapped in pieces of fabric. It does not look like something was made by maybe a graphic designer, so there's got to be a story there.
Yes, so our logo was done by the very talented Nuveen Barwadi, who is a Kurdish-American artist who grew up here in Middle Tennessee, or whose family has roots here in Middle Tennessee. And I love her work. It uses a lot of textiles, and part of that is because clothing is one of those things that people brought here when they had to flee. You might not be able to bring, furniture or your house or your apple orchard, but you could bring your clothing. And so that's become a very important part of identity as well. And that's something that shows up in a lot of Nuvine's work, is the way she uses textiles to kind of express a story. And in this one, another part of her art that she often uses is kind of this imagery of protest signs, those handwritten protest signs, because the Kurdish community has been very involved politically. A lot of folks in the diaspora do a lot of time advocating for the interests of folks back home. So a lot of the kids I talked to who grew up in Nashville remember, being dragged along to protest downtown and waving their flags and that being a big part of their childhood. So she incorporated both of those elements there, both the written protest style sign and the fabric, to create a logo that I just think is really beautiful.
Yeah, well, especially hearing that story, it is beautiful. I didn't want to say it looked like a poster board that someone might be holding up at a protest, but that's exactly what it looks like.
Exactly what it is.
Wow. We can't ignore that we're in another moment of violence in the Middle East, in another. Obviously, there's been so much. But I think about what's going on this week, and even in previous weeks. When you're thinking of Gaza or you're thinking about Iran, why is this story important in this moment? If you could put it into words.
Well, I have two main points to make here.
Okay.
I'd say the first is about this episode specifically, right? Which is about this massacre, which was later termed a genocide by the Iraqi Supreme Court in 2010. When I was visiting the memorial with the chemical attack survivor, Luqman Abdul Qadir, at the end of the memorial are a series of photos, and they're clearly new photos. And I asked him about them, and he said, those are photos of children who died in Syria from chemical attacks. And that's in the Halabja Memorial because he says that as a survivor, he considers every child who's died or every victim of a chemical attack since then to be almost an extension of what he survived, right? He considers them part and parcel of kind of this tragedy that's never really ended for him. And looking at those photos, the photos of the kids in Halabja look the same as the photos of the kids in Syria, look the same as the photos of the kids we see coming out of Gaza, right? So I think that's very relevant. That's a very relevant story right now. And hard to look at sometimes, right? And then to broaden it out a little bit to the story of America's involvement in the Middle East. I remember being a kid, like in middle school, and asking my dad, hey, what's up with Iraq? Like, what's the deal with Iraq? And he was like, okay. And he tried to explain, but there's so much context, and I wasn't alive for most of it. And
Yeah.
And I remember being so confused. Well, it took doing this podcast for me to understand, in the sense that...
Well, then explain it to us.
Yeah, in the sense that the story of the Kurdish people, especially the Kurdish people in Iraq, is so deeply tied to the story of America's involvement in the Middle East. Really going back to the 50s onward, and I kind of pick up that story in the 60s. They're so parallel because the Kurds are kind of... have enemies on all sides of them. That makes them a really useful ally, as far as they often share common enemies. So tracing the story of the Kurdish people and their alliances and betrayals by the U.S. over time really helps you understand how the U.S. has gotten to be where it is today in the Middle East, including how we got to invading Iraq in 2003, and including why things are the way they are right now with Iran and Israel, with Iraq right in the middle of the two.
Yeah. Well, it's a beautiful work of art and work of journalism. So thank you for putting your heart and soul into this and bringing it to us in such a beautiful fashion.
Well, thank you. I was grateful to be able to do it.
Rose Gilbert is host and reporter for The Country in Our Hearts. We'll be back with episode 2 tomorrow, or you can listen anywhere you like to listen to podcasts. You've been listening to a special broadcast of This is Nashville from Nashville Public Radio. Liv Lombardi is our technical director. I'm Blake Farmer. Rose, why don't you handle the credits for The Country in Our Hearts?
The Country in Our Hearts was reported and produced by me, Rose Gilbert. My editor and co-producer was Meribah Knight. Additional editing by Tony Gonzalez, LaTonya Turner, and Rachel Iacovone, with help from Marianna Bacallao, Char, Daston, and Justin Barney. Mac Limbaugh is Nashville Public Radio's Vice President of Audience and supported this project in many ways. Our community and cultural advisors on this project were Dr. David Romano and Dilman Yassin. Sound design was done by Martine Cruz, fact-checking by Daniel Potter, original logo artwork was done by Nuveen Barwari, traditional music by Arkandowski, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Special thanks to the Kurdish Memory Program for the audio of the victims of the Al Anfal chemical attacks. They have an amazing trove of resources and oral histories on their website, kurdishmemoryprogram.com. Thank you to Paul McAdoo, Jennifer Nelson, Namal Abdullah, Lukman Abdelkadir, and the Halabja Chemical Victims Society. Audio of the interview with a Halabja chemical attack victim is courtesy of Kurdistan 24. The Country in Our Hearts was made possible by the financial support of Nashville Public Radio listeners and special contributions by members Jackie Schrago, Fletcher Burton, and William D. Kenner, MD. Travel was funded in part by the Overseas Press Club, and the project received an important grant from Humanities Tennessee, an independent affiliate for the National Endowment for the Humanities. The findings and conclusions of this podcast do not necessarily represent the views of Humanities Tennessee or the National Endowment for the Humanities.